I'm James McIlvanney, and you're listening to the History and Philosophy of the Language Sciences podcast, online at hi-fi-langcij.net. There you can find links and references to all the literature we discuss. In this episode, we arrive in what could be described as the classical age of linguistic structuralism. Structuralism is a term that played an outsized role in the 20th century humanities and social sciences, especially in the French-speaking world. While the various forms of structuralism that appeared up to mid-century all had their own character, their generally acknowledged ultimate source lay in methodological and epistemological innovations emanating from linguistics. Roman Jakobson is one of the central figures here, for his pioneering contributions to linguistic structuralism, and also for the cross-pollination that he effected between centres of learning across Europe and North America, and across different academic disciplines. Originally from Moscow, his somewhat peripatetic career included major stations in Prague, New York, and Boston, and his own work was not confined to linguistics, but included also literary studies, and he was in close contact with scholars working in such fields as anthropology and cybernetics. It was Jakobson who first used the term structuralism in print in a specifically linguistic sense. We must note, however, that the term had already been used in other contexts by this time, most significantly in psychology. We'll explore this psychological usage in a future episode. Jakobson developed his main structuralist ideas while working in Prague, where he was a core member of the Prague Linguistic Circle. This was a group of language scholars that formed around the Czech linguist Willem Matthesius, professor of English philology at the Charles University in Prague. The Prague Circle was an academic discussion group of a kind that was a feature of intellectual life in 1920s Central Europe. Another more famous circle of this kind that we might want to compare it to is the Vienna Circle, which gave birth to logical positivism, one of the foundations of analytic philosophy. The Vienna Circle, Prague Circle, and other similar groups of this era had several common characteristics. They served as venues for academic debate, and each group usually developed a party line that was spelt out in a manifesto. These circles were also generally in contact with one another. The year in which the official position of the Prague Circle coalesced was 1928. In this year, the Circle members began preparing a series of theses, essentially a manifesto, that were presented at the First International Conference of Slavists, which was held in Prague the following year, 1929. In connection with this public emergence of the Prague Circle, Roman Jakobson published an article, also in 1929, outlining the Circle's program, and it was in this article that he used structuralism in a specifically linguistic sense for the first time. There he wrote, "Were we to comprise the leading idea of present-day science in its most various manifestations, we could hardly find a more appropriate designation than structuralism. Any set of phenomena examined by contemporary science is treated not as a mechanical agglomeration, but as a structural whole, and the basic task is to reveal the inner, whether static or developmental, laws of this system." So the central preoccupation of structuralism, according to Jakobson, is to capture and account for the structural whole of languages, with the aim of revealing the inner laws of this system. This is opposed to the idea of treating each language as a mere mechanical agglomeration. As we'll recall from episode 12, where we looked at Saussure and his contributions to linguistics, the charge of treating languages as mechanical agglomerations was generally levelled at the neo-grammarians, who formed the dominant school of linguistics in the closing decades of the 19th century. The neo-grammarians were also Jakobson's target, a point that he makes much more explicitly in other texts, and which was also made by other members of the Prague Circle. But from episode 12, we'll also recall that this common criticism of the neo-grammarians was perhaps slightly misplaced. There are in fact strong lines of continuity between neo-grammarian scholarship and the holistic system-oriented thinking of the structuralists. This is quite evident on the example of Saussure himself. Saussure's neo-grammarian teachers accused him of plagiarism in his earliest proto-structuralist work, his 1879 memoir on the original system of Indo-European vowels. We can debate the merits of these accusations, but the fact that they could be credibly made is an indication that the leading neo-grammarians didn't see a sudden and decisive break between their own work and that of the next generations. So what did Roman Jakobson's structuralism look like in practice? To get an idea of this, let's have a look at phonological theory as it was developed by him and his colleague Nikolai Trubetzkoy during the years in which they were associated with the Prague Circle. Jakobson and Trubetzkoy were acknowledged as the chief theorists of phonology in the Circle, and their phonology was in turn seen as one of the Circle's main areas of research, embodying many conceptual and methodological innovations that defined the Circle's approach. The key notion in Jakobson and Trubetzkoy's phonology, and across all schools engaged in phonological research in this period, is the phoneme. Even today, the phoneme remains a fundamental concept in linguistics, and phonemic analysis of one stripe or another is among the earliest topics taught in any introductory linguistics course. As a preliminary to our historical discussion, let's just briefly review what phoneme means to most present-day linguists. The basic idea behind the phoneme is that while there might be a huge number of sounds that the human mouth can articulate, and which the human ear can perceive, each language only uses a restricted subset of these sounds to distinguish words. Even more importantly, the sounds used in a language vary in a way that is both regular, in the sense that we can formulate rules describing this variation, and arbitrary, in that the variation is not directly determined by any external facts of articulation or auditory perception, but is simply a fact about the structure of the sound system of each language. For example, we can say that in English there are two phonemes, p and b, which we usually write with the letters p and b. These are distinct phonemes because they contrast with one another and can be used to distinguish words. The only difference in sound between the words park, a grassy space with trees, and bark, the skin of one of those trees, is the first phoneme of the respective words, p or b. But the p phoneme is not always pronounced the same way. In the word spark, for example, the p phoneme is realized without aspiration. That is, when we say park, there's a puff of air when the p is released, but when we say spark, there is no puff of air. Park, spark. This is a consistent pattern in the sound system of English. When a voiceless stop follows s at the beginning of a word, the stop is always unaspirated. Unaspirated p and aspirated p never contrast with one another in English to distinguish words. For this reason, we can say that they are two variant realizations of a single phoneme. In modern linguistic parlance, these variants are usually referred to as allophones. This variation is part of the largely subconscious structure of the English language. If you ask most native English speakers who haven't taken Linguistics 101, they probably won't even be aware of this consistent difference in pronunciation. But this pattern in the English sound system is not a universal fact of human language. In a language like Hindi, for example, there is a contrast between unaspirated and aspirated voiceless stops. So p and p constitute two separate phonemes. Indeed, there's also an aspirated voiced b, which contrasts with unaspirated voiced b. This b is, of course, a sound that doesn't occur in English at all. So in Hindi, there are 4 distinct phonemes in a phonetic space out of which English carves only 2 phonemes. The classical definition of the phoneme, as understood by Jakobson and Trubetzkoy, can be found in Trubetzkoy's 1939 Principles of Phonology. There, Trubetzkoy wrote, "Phonological units that, from the standard of a given language, cannot be analysed into still smaller successive distinctive units are phonemes. Accordingly, the phoneme is the smallest distinctive unit of a given language. The signifier aspect of every word in the system of language can be analysed into phonemes. That is, it can be represented by a particular sequence of phonemes. Trubetzkoy went on to observe that phonemes are not so much building blocks that make up a word, but rather distinctive marks or significant elements into which the Gestalt or whole of the word can be analysed. He illustrated this using the analogy of a tune, writing, "Consequently, one can say that each word can be completely analysed into phonemes. That is, consists of phonemes in the same way as a tune composed in a major scale can be said to consist of the tones of that scale, although each tune will contain something that makes it a specific musical configuration. The phoneme itself," he added, "is merely a bundle of phonologically distinct properties. There are phonetic differences that serve to distinguish one sound from another, and others that do not. We just saw, for example, that in English, aspiration on stops is a consistent difference in the phonological system, but it's not a difference that can distinguish one word from another. Only the presence or absence of voicing serves to distinguish stops at the same place of articulation. So voicing is the distinctive feature, or phonologically relevant mark, as Trubetzkoy put it, that differentiates the p phoneme from the b phoneme." By the time Trubetzkoy and Jakobson began working with the concept of the phoneme in the 1920s, it had already taken on recognizable shape. Their understanding of the phoneme was informed to a large degree by work that had been undertaken in their native Russia in previous decades. Both Jakobson and Trubetzkoy were from Moscow and had received the bulk of their education there, but both emigrated from Russia in the early 1920s as the Bolsheviks secured their hold on power in the years following the October Revolution. Trubetzkoy's reasons for leaving the country were fairly clear. He was, in fact, Prince Trubetzkoy, a member of the high aristocracy. Jakobson, on the other hand, had a more ambivalent relationship to the revolution. He was initially enthusiastic about the renewal it promised, but soon became disillusioned with the Bolsheviks. The central figures in the Russian lineage of the phoneme are Jan Baudouin de Courtenay and his student Mikołaj Kruszewski. Baudouin de Courtenay and Kruszewski were both actually Polish, but were subjects of the Russian Tsar. In the period in which they worked together, in the 1870s and 80s, there was no Polish state. Poland had been divided up at the end of the 18th century between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and only regained its independence at the end of World War I. Baudouin de Courtenay and Kruszewski were both from territories that had been incorporated into the Russian Empire, and worked together at the University of Kazan, where Baudouin was professor from 1875 to 1883. Already in his lectures in Kazan in the 1870s, Baudouin noted that, from a psychological point of view, the sounds of every language constitute a system that is peculiar to that language, much in the same way that the notes of a musical scale form a system. In the syllabus for his course in the academic year 1876 to 1877, he included lectures on sound systems of languages, where he provided the following summary. He wrote, "Physiologically identical sounds of different languages have a distinctive value depending on their place within the entire sound system and their relation to other sounds. Comparison with the tones of music." This looks very much like a formulation of the central insight of later phonemic theory, that every language has its own arbitrary sound system that configures concrete sounds in different ways. But we have to be careful not to read too much into it. This statement appears in the part of Baudouin's course that deals with the historical comparative reconstruction of sounds, and is perhaps best understood in the context of the latest neo-grammarian work. As we discussed in episode 9, the neo-grammarians made a distinction between physiological and psychological aspects of sound change, and they already began working with hypothetical sounds as algebraic placeholders in sound systems to be reconstructed. Once again, it might be better to treat the advent of structuralism as a story of gradual evolution rather than sudden revolutionary change. Krzyzewski developed Baudouin's ideas further in his work on sound alternations. This topic is concerned with the regular variation in the sounds of a language, although the variations that are treated are much broader than the kind of allophonic variation that we talked about a moment ago when we introduced the phoneme concept as it's understood today. Krzyzewski's alternations are much broader in that they mix synchronic and diachronic considerations, and in that they were not strictly phonological in character, but rather also bound up with the morphology of languages. To name the units that were involved in these alternations that he was studying, Krzyzewski adopted the term phoneme. The term phoneme, in its original French form, already had some currency in the discussions of the Society of Linguistics of Paris in the 1870s. But in these discussions it lacked any explicit definition or detailed theoretical background. The first steps towards theorization came with Saussure's memoir in 1879, where one of the terms that Saussure used to name the hypothetical sounds he reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European was phoneme. Saussure chose this term perhaps because it existed as a suggestive neologism, but was still not associated with any particular theoretical positions. It allowed him to indicate that he was talking about some sort of hypothetical construct, without saying precisely what it was. Krzyzewski was inspired by Saussure's usage in the memoir, and this is why he adopted the term. From the 1880s onwards, Baudouin continued to refine Krzyzewski's work on sound alternations, and also adopted the term phoneme himself. Baudouin's phoneme was still tied up with morphological considerations, but developed a more clearly synchronic character. The phoneme is a purely phonological unit, treated independently of morphological processes, crystallized in the work of Russian linguist Lev Sterber, a student of Baudouin's from later in his career, after he moved to become professor in St. Petersburg. In 1912, Sterber defined the phoneme as the shortest general phonetic representation in a given language that is capable of associating with representations of meaning and of differentiating words. Although Jakobson and Trubetzkoy were not the immediate heirs of Baudouin de Courtenay and the school he left behind in St. Petersburg, it's still this later version of the phoneme concept that most clearly informed their approach to phonology. The evolution of the phoneme concept that we've just sketched provides us with an opportunity to observe some of the ways in which Jakobson and Trubetzkoy's structuralism was in fact rather different from Saussure's views, even though Saussure was frequently cited as an inspiration. Saussure was aware of the conceptual and terminological innovations made by Baudouin de Courtenay and his students, and used the term phoneme again in his course in general linguistics, although in a different sense from in his memoir. In the course, the phoneme is the abstract unit into which language speakers divide the stream of speech. But we should note that, because the phoneme has to do with the production and perception of speech, Saussure considered it, somewhat surprisingly, to be an entity that belongs to la parole and not to la langue. This is surprising because key elements of our current concept of the phoneme are in a sense built into his definition of la langue. We'll recall from episode 12 that Saussure said in the course that in a language there are only differences without positive terms. In terms of signifiers, there are only phonic differences issuing from the system that serve to distinguish one element from another. But any talk of how those differences might actually be instantiated in sounds, that is, talk of phonemes, immediately leaves the realm of the abstract langue and enters the world of concrete parole. But Jakobson and Trubetzkoy, in examining the marks or distinctive features that serve to distinguish one phoneme from another, were trying precisely to investigate the structure of sound systems with reference to their material features. If we now return to the quote from Jakobson with which we opened this episode, will recall that he described structuralism as the leading idea of present-day science in its most various manifestations. This is not an exaggeration on Jakobson's part. The holism and system-oriented thinking that characterized his structuralism, and the polemical contrast to atomism and mechanical thinking, were not a peculiarity of linguistic scholarship in this period, but could be found across the arts and sciences. In their 2007 book Objectivity, the historians of science Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison discuss epistemological manifestations of these ideas under the rubric of structural objectivity. They highlight how researchers around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, working on such disparate topics as the science of colour perception, the fundamentals of geometry and arithmetic, and the nature of physical space and time, converged on the idea that we can't know the world in its material substance, but rather that all we know is the relations between things in the world. Our perceptual capacities allow us to reach agreement on the relations between things, and this is what grants us objective knowledge. Such ideas were widespread, but one of the most prominent strands of research that had a direct influence on Jakobson, Trubetzkoy, and the Prague Circle more broadly was Gestalt psychology. There were various schools of Gestalt psychology, each with their own approaches and emphases, but uniting them all was the central insistence that human cognition is fundamentally holistic. The core area of Gestalt research was the psychology of perception, which centered around experiments that demonstrate how our perception is in the first instance holistic. We first perceive the whole, and only then do we analyze it into parts. The Gestalt psychologists generally contrasted their work to that of philosopher and psychologist Wilhelm Wundt, who was teacher to some of them. Although Wundt acknowledged Gestalt phenomena, he still preferred to build up perception from atomistic sense data. The polemical contrast the Gestalt psychologists set up between their research and that of their predecessors is perhaps of the same kind that we've already seen repeatedly in linguistics. Jakobson frequently cited the work of Gestalt psychologists and drew out the parallels to his structuralism. We might recall also that in the quote from Trubetzkoy's Principles of Phonology that we mentioned earlier, that Trubetzkoy specifically referred to phonemes as gestalts. Another example that further illustrates the connections between structuralism and Gestalt psychology is the recurring comparison of phonological systems of languages to musical melodies and keys. We saw both Baudouin de Courtenay and Trubetzkoy make this comparison. Christian von Ehrenfels, professor of philosophy in Prague from 1896 until 1929, and teacher to some of the first generation of Gestalt psychologists, famously used a very similar example in his 1890 essay on Gestalt qualities. There he highlighted the fact that a musical melody can be transposed into other keys and still be recognized as the same melody. A melody, therefore, does not consist in the exact notes that are played, but rather in the relations between those notes. Avant-garde art in this period also took a turn that inspired structuralist thought. Jakobson was fond of pointing to the Cubist movement in visual art, which typically involved abstract representations of the subject broken down into its elements, often shown simultaneously from different viewpoints. In the realm of language, Jakobson was closely associated with the literary movement of Russian futurism and its genre of zaum, or transrational poetry, which abandoned grammatical language and even words with a clear denotational meaning, and instead embraced the creation of new word forms based on onomatopoeia and sound symbolism, a procedure that served to focus attention on the formal structural features of sounds in language. While Prague Circle structuralism formed at the confluence of these various intellectual currents in the early 20th century, it also had a great influence of its own across the humanities and social sciences. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Jakobson left Czechoslovakia for neutral Scandinavia, and finally in 1941 he departed for New York, where he became part of the vibrant scene of émigré European intellectuals in that city. This community had its institutional base at the New School for Social Research, which hosted many European refugee academics, including Jakobson, in the so-called University in Exile. Among the notable contacts Jakobson made at the New School was the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who famously adopted Jakobson's structuralist methods in linguistics to ethnography. After the war, Lévi-Strauss returned to France, where his structuralism propagated throughout the humanities and became the standard doctrine underpinning post-war French thought, a story recounted by François Doss in his 2-volume History of Structuralism. Jakobson himself remained in the United States, where in 1949 he became professor at Harvard University, and where he exerted a great influence on the further development of American linguistics, a topic to which we'll turn in coming episodes. But in the next episode, we turn to another side of linguistic scholarship in the first decades of the 20th century, the place of meaning.